Since the combat update, fleeing boots have gone through a complete rework because the rapid fire mobility is now built directly into the range kit at the cost of the accuracy bonus it once provided. Now, fleeing boots are supposed to be boots that synergize with snipe. However, with stronger endgame options like Elite Dragonbane boots contributing towards the Elite Dragonbane set effect, or the Masterwork boots offering higher base damage and helps with delaying damage. I found it really difficult to justify using fleeting boots in the endgame, because if I'm questioning whether or not Masterwork boots is worth it or not, I'd rather take the extra adrenaline on the rapid fire from Elite Dragonbane boots than the fleeting boots. But what about the early game? After all, there's still a very cheap upgrade that you can buy from the Grand Exchange. So today, let's explore whether these boots actually have a place in the early game. I'm Wings of Absurdity, a ranged content creator. Let's find out. Just so we're all on the same page, let's quickly go over what fleeting boots actually do. They allow basic ranged attacks to reduce the cooldown of snipe, which normally has a 1-minute cooldown. Piercing shot already reduces snipe's cooldown, and fleeting boots helps removes an extra 1.2 seconds when you use piercing shot. On paper, that sounds pretty good. The problem is that, especially in endgame range, piercing shot and basic attacks are barely used in death swiftness setups. That's where I start questioning whether shaving a few seconds off of Snipe's cooldown is really worth replacing your boot slot. Snipe also has terrible synergy with Gale Shot, ECB, and Imbue Shadow. In a lot of ways, Snipe feels like it goes directly against the entire identity of modern range combat. The Flea Boots doesn't have an anti-switching mechanic, so in theory, you could start doing some absurd switchscape setups with it. Realistically though, I doubt most players are going to bother with it, and when you compare Snipe to another core ranged ability like Snapshot, the damage difference really isn't that massive. Meanwhile, Snipe still has the disadvantage of being a channeled ability compared to Snapshot's instant activation. The boots are also technically tier 80, which you can upgrade them to tier 90 using a shadow spike. The problem is that the shadow spikes are extremely expensive for such a tiny stat increase, which is definitely not worth the price. Enough theory crafting though, let's actually test whether these boots have a place in the early game when you don't have access to the full endgame range kit. Based on my experiences from leagues, I tried to recreate a cheap range setup for a normal non-iron player. I already have an enhanced fleeting boots, so I just use this one. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about greater ricochet and greater death swiftness, so for these tests, I actually removed greater ricochet from my action bar entirely and used piercing shot as the replacement. This already gives fleeting boots a massive head start since not having ricochet is a huge handicap for range. There isn't much I can do about greater death swiftness, and I'm not using any invention perks as well. I decided to compare forcing myself to use fleeting boots effect versus simply playing normally and snapshot spamming. In my regular kills at Vindicta, I just start with Imbue Shadow. Even without ricochet, I could immediately feel how much slower it was to build adrenaline to use death swiftness. Despite that handicap, I still barely felt the need to use snipe. Most of the time, I just spammed snapshot whenever possible and ended up with kills around the 45-second range. The average kill times looked something like this. Now for the next part of the test, I forced myself to actively use snipe. At first, I tried fully committing to fleeting boots by constantly spamming basics just so I could reduce Snipe's cooldown as much as possible, even when I had far stronger abilities available. And to no surprise, the kill was awful at 1 minute and 1 seconds, which is very slow. So I scrapped that idea immediately. Then I thought, What if I used Snipe before Imbue Shadow instead? This was actually more interesting because I already spent a lot of time using Piercing Shot and basic attacks to build Adrenaline for death swiftness. But remember, this test bans Ricochet completely, so in a real setup, this scenario wouldn't be realistic. Still, I decided to run these tests, and yeah, I was able to fit 2 snipes in a single kill. But even then, the results barely changed, and in fact, it was actually slower. At this point, I thought maybe Vindicta just dies too quickly, so I went into hard mode Vindicta, hoping the boss would survive long enough for the boots to matter more. Well, the boss put up too good of a fight because I actually got slapped around like a bug. So I moved on to normal mode Kerapac instead. Since this boss actually makes me switch prayers, I just used the Desolation Curse because I couldn't be bothered changing my quick prayers. I also banned the use of Time Warp to avoid adding extra layers of complexity to the test. My win book was off because of my death at Vindicta. Since my Pontifex ring is still fully upgraded, I did have the stun immunity effect, which does help with these results. Still, Snipe actually feels pretty nice when you're walking under Kerapac, so it's an ability I use more often here regardless. I tested the setup using Snipe heavily and ended up with these kill times. I started thinking maybe the longer fight duration itself was making Fleety Boots seem better because Snipe naturally gets more opportunities to come off cooldown. So I dug out my ancient Flarefrost boots from the bank. Yes, I still have them. I could definitely feel the longer Snipe cooldown difference without Fleety Boots, especially since I wasn't using Time Warp. Surprisingly though, my first kill was actually faster, 158.8. That completely caught me off guard. Dumbfounded, I did 2 more kills and landed a 206 kill time. I started counting how many snapshots and snipes I was actually using per kill, which because the last phase took longer, I spent more snapshots but I used the same number of snipes. It turns out that inconsistency came from the fact that I chose to face Kerapac by using an extra rapid fire instead of building for death swiftness, so that was the main reason for this discrepancy in the kill times. Either way, the amount of snipes I used between each of the kills did not change with or without Fleety Boots. So what was the point of Fleety Boots if the frequency of my snipes stayed the same? So what's the verdict with the current state of Fleety Boots? Fleety Boots are still a solid early game upgrade because they're extremely cheap, but don't expect the effect to completely change the ranged playstyle. Snipe still clashes badly with the core synergies of Imbue Shadow and Gale Shot, and realistically, you do not want to be spamming Piercing Shot or basic attacks during Death Swiftness unless you have no other choice. Especially in the endgame, once you unlock greater ricochet, I'm either snapshot spamming or dumping all my adrenaline into Gloomfire Bow. I rarely touch Piercing Shot or the range basic attack at all, and if I do, it's only once, which is negligible. Now, interestingly enough, there's another old range gear piece that I think actually has more potential than Fleeting Boots. The Enchanted Enhanced Nightmare Gauntlets. I may cover that in a future video. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you enjoyed, and bye bye.